Hello, Professor Frankema. Again, we are summarizing in form of a conversation, some questions from my side, the basic conclusions of this seminar on colonial legacies. And in your case, we're talking about Africa, and you presented a real interesting paper because you use case studies to discuss general theories. So I would like to briefly summarize for this interview which are the general theories on this idea that the European settlement in Africa had a persistent effect over time.
So the general idea is that European settlement brought new technologies, transfer of human capital and skills. And there is also an important strand of literature that stresses the so-called developmental institutions that come with European settlement. On the other hand, since the levels of European settlement in sub-Saharan Africa have always remained low, there is also a counterpart to that, and that is also stressed in the literature, and that is that Europeans were mainly there to extract and also implement extractive institutions, so-called extractive institutions, and that is sort of the model of the theory that I try to challenge in the paper that I presented, particularly by stressing that there is no evidence that in all cases colonial governments would support the interests of settler populations. We have actually many cases in sub-Saharan Africa where they would do the opposite and act in the interest of African smallholders, particularly in the cultivation of cash crops.
The other question is, one of the strong points of your paper is to stress this diversity in the African countries. But there is also diversity, and you stress that very much on the colonial policy. I mean, the British colonial institution or policy is not the same in the German case or the Belgium, but in the end, everybody had the same idea. The standard idea is that it was an European colonial policy, and apparently it's not a single European colonial policy in Africa.
That's right, because I'm convinced that the local circumstances and the variety in local circumstances have a much bigger influence on the way colonial policies are designed and shaped than the metropolitan blueprints, if you wish, of French style of colonial rule or British style of colonial rule. And this perspective also allows us then to look much more closely at the differential role of African agency in shaping these processes. So, to look at the colonial era in Africa from a European perspective is to look at it only from one side of the coin, and we need to take that other perspective into account as well if we want to understand what drives settlement processes and what drives institutional change.
So that's the final question is related to that, because given the fact that the colonial policy for the British or the Germans was different, still we have the view that the colonial legacy was wrong for Africa. I mean, all colonial policy and all metropolis had the same effect in the end.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, it is extremely difficult to make a cost-benefit balance. But if you would need to summarize this, I think on the negative side, you could really argue that what colonialism did in the sort of 80 years that it was implemented from about 1880 until 1960, was it deepened a pattern of economic specialization, particularly in commodity production and commodity exports that was already there in the 19th century, but was sort of further stressed and further emphasized. In that sense, colonialism put sub-Saharan African economies on a trajectory, and they are still very much on that trajectory. On the other hand, to the positive side, you can also argue that colonial rule at least introduced some rudimentary structures that you need in order to create more diverse economies. Those structures were very rudimentary, and it has not produced economic diversification as yet, but those structures are in the end really fundamental to get a more sustainable path of economic growth, what we call modern economic growth. And it is perhaps we are going to see that in the 21st century, but it, of course, is still unsure.
Okay, thank you very much.